Picture this. Your name is Senator Gaius Flavius, and you're standing in the marble corridors of the Palatine Palace in the year 190, clutching an imperial summons that makes your hands shake with dread. The parchment bears the seal of Emperor Commodus, son of the philosopher Marcus Aurelius. But the man who rules Rome now bears no resemblance to his noble father. The message is simple and terrifying. Bring your daughter Claudia to tonight's feast. The emperor wishes to inspect her personally. You've heard the whispers from other senators whose families have received similar invitations. Some returned home broken and silent. Others never returned at all. Your beautiful 16-year-old daughter, who just yesterday was laughing with her tutors about Greek poetry, is about to enter a world where the most powerful man on earth treats human beings like toys in his personal collection of degradation and terror. Through the palace windows, you can hear the roar of crowds at the Colosseum, where Commodus performs his twisted gladiatorial spectacles, mixing violence with sexual humiliation in ways that make veteran soldiers vomit in disgust. The emperor, who once proclaimed himself the reincarnation of Hercules, has transformed Rome's most sacred institutions into theaters for his personal appetites, turning government meetings into procurement sessions for his collection of victims. What's about to happen to your daughter represents just one night in a reign of terror that has systematically corrupted every aspect of Roman civilization. This isn't just about imperial excess, but about how absolute power can transform a human being into something that challenges the very definition of humanity. Commodus didn't just rule Rome, he weaponized it, turning the entire empire into a machine designed to feed his increasingly extreme desires. You think you know about Roman decadence from movies and history books? The orgies, the gladiators, the political corruption? Here's what they don't show you about the emperor who made Caligula look restrained by comparison. Behind the marble facades and golden statues was a systematic reign of intimate terror that turned senators into procurers, their families into entertainment, and the Roman state into the world's most sophisticated trafficking operation. One particular ritual Commodus designed for tonight's feast was so disturbing that Roman historians who documented every detail of imperial cruelty struggle to find words that could capture its horror. The most chilling part? He genuinely believed his victims should thank him for the honor. Before we follow Senator Flavius and his daughter into this nightmare that redefined imperial power, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you think you can handle the truth about what Roman civilization became under its most depraved ruler, smash that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will make every other tale of imperial excess seem like children's stories. Your daughter's waiting in the corridor outside, and her innocence dies tonight. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he left behind philosophical writings that would inspire humanity for centuries, and a son whose reign would represent the absolute corruption of everything the philosopher-emperor had tried to build. Commodus didn't gradually descend into madness. He plunged into depravity so quickly that Roman society couldn't adapt to the systematic destruction of every moral boundary that had defined their civilization. The contrast between father and son was so extreme that contemporary historians struggled to believe they shared the same blood. Marcus Aurelius has spent his reign fighting to preserve Roman virtue, writing meditations on duty and self-control while defending the empire's borders. Commodus spent his reign destroying Roman virtue from within, turning the imperial palace into what scandalized observers described as a combination brothel, torture chamber, and religious theater where human suffering was transformed into divine entertainment. The speed of Rome's moral collapse under Commodus was unprecedented in imperial history. Within months of his accession, the Palatine Palace had been reorganized around his personal appetite for intimate violence and degradation. Rooms that had once hosted philosophical discussions were converted into chambers designed for activities so disturbing the palace staff drew lots to determine who would be required to clean up afterward. Contemporary sources document the systematic recruitment process that Commodus established to stock his imperial collection of human playthings. Unlike previous emperors who relied on slaves and prostitutes, Commodus specifically targeted the families of senators, generals, and provincial governors, understanding that their suffering would demonstrate his absolute power while providing psychological entertainment that surpassed anything available from professional entertainers. The legal framework that had protected Roman families for centuries dissolved overnight as Commodus issued decrees that granted him unlimited access to any citizen's relatives for imperial service. Resistance meant treason charges that resulted in the entire family facing crucifixion or worse. Archaeological evidence from the Palatine complex reveals the physical infrastructure that Commodus built to support his systematic exploitation of Roman elite families. Recent excavations have uncovered specialized chambers, restraint systems, and drainage systems that could only have served the purposes described in ancient sources. The scale and sophistication of these facilities suggest that intimate violence had become the primary function of imperial government. The psychological impact on Roman society was immediate and devastating. Senators who had once competed for the honor of addressing the emperor now drew lots to determine who would be required to attend imperial gatherings, where their presence might result in demands for family members to participate in. Activities that violated every principle of Roman moral philosophy. Foreign ambassadors provided external perspectives on Rome's rapid transformation under Commodus. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in archives from Parthia, Germania, and Egypt describes a civilization that seemed to be consuming itself from within, led by a ruler whose appetites had transcended normal human categories and entered realms that challenged observers' ability to maintain their own sanity. The economic implications were equally disturbing. Roman tax records from this period show massive expenditures on facilities, equipment, and personnel dedicated to what official documents euphemistically described as imperial entertainment and religious observance. The empire's resources were being systematically redirected from military defense and public works to funding the emperor's increasingly elaborate systems of human exploitation. Religious institutions that had provided stability for centuries found themselves corrupted by imperial demands that violated every sacred principle they had once protected. Vestal virgins were forced to participate in ceremonies that mocked their vows of chastity. Temple priests were required to conduct rituals that transformed places of worship into theaters for systematic abuse. Even the sacred texts were reinterpreted to justify practices that would have horrified their authors. The medical establishment became complicit in systematic abuse, as physicians were required to develop techniques for enhancing victim suffering while preventing death that might interrupt imperial entertainment. Roman medical texts from this period contain procedures that read more like torture manuals than healing guides, revealing how completely professional ethics had been corrupted by imperial demands. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly Roman society adapted to the new moral environment. Citizens who had once defined themselves through concepts of honor, dignity, and civic virtue learned to navigate a world where survival required participating in or enabling systematic, intimate violence against their neighbors and family members. The systematic nature of Commodus's reign becomes clear when examining the detailed records that survived his eventual assassination. These weren't random acts of imperial axis, but carefully planned programs designed to break down every social bond that might threaten absolute imperial authority. By making every Roman complicit in systematic abuse, Commodus created a society too morally compromised to organize effective resistance. The transformation of Roman civilization under Commodus represents one of history's most rapid and complete moral collapses, demonstrating how quickly advanced societies can be corrupted when systematic, intimate violence becomes state policy and resistance becomes impossible through legal, economic, and social pressure that turns citizens into accomplices in their own civilization's destruction. Within his first year as emperor, Commodus had transformed the Palatine Palace from the administrative center of the Roman Empire into what contemporary observers described as the world's most sophisticated procurement operation for human beings destined for intimate exploitation. The systematic efficiency with which he organized this transformation reveals planning that began long before his father's death, suggesting that Rome's moral collapse had been carefully orchestrated rather than spontaneously developed. The recruitment process operated through official government channels, using the same administrative systems that collected taxes and organized military conscription. Provincial governors received detailed instructions about the types of individuals required for imperial service, with specific criteria regarding age, appearance, family status, and social position. These weren't requests, but imperial commands backed by military force and legal authority that made resistance equivalent to treason against the Roman state. Senator Flavius discovered the systematic nature of this procurement when his own daughter Claudia was selected based on reports filed by imperial agents who had been observing senatorial families for months, cataloging their children's development and identifying those who met the emperor's specific preferences. The selection wasn't random, but the result of careful surveillance and evaluation designed to maximize the psychological impact on both victims and their families. The palace staff responsible for managing Commodus's collection included former senators who had been broken through similar processes and now served as intermediaries who understood both imperial demands and aristocratic psychology. These men helped design recruitment strategies that exploited Roman concepts of honor and duty, convincing parents that submitting to imperial demands demonstrated loyalty and civic virtue rather than moral cowardice. The logistics of housing and managing hundreds of victims required converting entire sections of the palace complex into facilities that combined luxury accommodations with total control systems. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized architecture designed to prevent escape while maintaining the aesthetic standards that Commodus demanded for his human collection. These weren't dungeons but gilded prisons that psychologically reinforced the emperor's message that his victims were privileged rather than exploited. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological conditioning process that transformed kidnapped Roman youth into willing participants in their own exploitation. The techniques involved systematic isolation from previous support systems, replacement of normal social relationships with dependence on imperial approval, and gradual introduction to activities that normalized extreme behavior through carefully calibrated stages of moral compromise. The palace medical staff developed specialized knowledge for maintaining the health and appearance of the imperial collection, while also ensuring their psychological compliance through substances that affected mood, memory, and resistance to suggestion. Roman physicians who had once taken oaths to do no harm found themselves administering treatments designed to enhance victim suffering while preventing death that might interrupt imperial entertainment. The genius of Commodus's system lay not just in its scale, but in how it weaponized traditional Roman values against the families he targeted. He understood that senators and governors who might resist direct threats to themselves could be controlled through threats to their children, wives, and relatives who became hostages to ensure political compliance and personal cooperation with imperial demands. The process began with seemingly innocent invitations to palace social events, where Commodus could personally evaluate potential additions to his collection. These gatherings were disguised as traditional Roman hospitality, but functioned as selection sessions where the emperor identified targets, while their parents were forced to watch helplessly as their children were assessed like livestock, being evaluated for purchase. Senator Marcus Brutus Maximus left detailed records of one such evening where his 14-year-old son was required to demonstrate various skills and capabilities, while Commodus provided commentary that made the evaluation's true purpose increasingly obvious. The senator understood that resistance would result in his entire family facing treason charges, while cooperation would result in his son's systematic exploitation, creating an impossible choice between political survival and moral integrity. The emperor's demands escalated systematically, beginning with requests for brief palace visits that gradually extended into overnight stays, then week-long residencies, and, finally, permanent transfer of custody disguised as appointments to imperial service positions that carried prestigious titles, but involved duties too horrific for official documentation. Parents watched their children disappear into the palace complex while maintaining the legal fiction that such service represented honor rather than abduction. The psychological warfare was particularly sophisticated in how it exploited Roman concepts of male honor and paternal authority. Fathers were forced to personally deliver their children to exploitation while maintaining dignified composure that demonstrated their worthiness to remain in imperial favor. This participation in their own family's destruction created psychological trauma that ensured their continued cooperation and silence about palace activities. Roman matrons faced even more complex psychological pressure as Commodus specifically targeted beautiful wives and daughters to demonstrate that no traditional protection could resist imperial desire. Women who had spent their lives in protected domestic environments found themselves thrust into situations that violated every principle of female respectability, while their husbands and fathers were forced to witness their degradation as proof of imperial power. The blackmail system was comprehensive and self-reinforcing. Once families had been compromised through forced participation in imperial activities, they became complicit in recruiting other families to share their burden and reduce their individual visibility. Former victims became procurers who understood exactly what they were condemning others to experience, creating networks of mutual guilt that prevented organized resistance. The documentation of these recruitment networks, preserved in imperial archives, reveals the systematic nature of Commodus's approach to corrupting Roman society. Every prominent family was eventually drawn into the system, either as direct victims or as accomplices, who helped identify and deliver new targets, creating a web of complicity that made resistance impossible and moral recovery unthinkable. Commodus's most disturbing innovation was his combination of gladiatorial combat with systematic intimate abuse, creating spectacles that transformed the Colosseum from a venue for honorable martial display into a theater for degradation that challenged spectators' capacity to witness human suffering disguised as imperial entertainment and religious ceremony. The traditional gladiatorial format was modified to include preliminary activities that involved captured enemies, condemned criminals, and members of the imperial collection in scenarios that combined violence with intimate humiliation. These weren't spontaneous additions to standard arena programming, but carefully choreographed productions that required extensive preparation, specialized equipment, and trained personnel who understood their roles in creating maximum psychological impact on both participants and audiences. Contemporary accounts describe Commodus personally designing these spectacles to demonstrate his absolute power over every category of human being within the Roman Empire. Foreign prisoners represented conquered territories, condemned criminals represented domestic justice, and members of his personal collection represented the complete submission of Roman elite society to imperial will expressed through systematic violence and degradation. The emperor's personal participation in these events went far beyond the theatrical gladiatorial combat that historians typically emphasize. Commodus used his appearances in the arena to demonstrate techniques and procedures that spectators were expected to appreciate as artistic achievements rather than criminal violence. His performances became educational demonstrations, where systematic abuse was presented as imperial innovation worthy of applause and admiration. The audience composition for these specialized events reveals the systematic nature of Commodus's approach to social control. Attendance was mandatory for senators, generals, provincial governors, and other elite Romans whose presence served multiple functions. They witnessed demonstrations of imperial power. They became complicit in systematic abuse through their forced participation as observers, and they provided a pool of potential victims whose family members might be selected for future performances. Roman historians struggled to document these events because traditional language lacked vocabulary for activities that combined military spectacle, religious ceremony, intimate violence, and political demonstration into single performances that challenged every category of normal human experience. Their written accounts suggest psychological trauma among chroniclers who found themselves documenting systematic corruption of institutions they had once considered sacred. The international implications were immediate and devastating for Roman diplomatic relationships. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these spectacles returned to their home kingdoms with accounts that portrayed Roman civilization as fundamentally diseased in ways that threatened stability throughout the Mediterranean world. Several kingdoms severed diplomatic ties, rather than risk their representatives' psychological contamination through exposure to imperial entertainment. The long-term psychological impact on Roman society was profound and lasting. Citizens who attended these mandatory spectacles developed collective trauma that affected their relationships, their ability to maintain normal social bonds, and their capacity to distinguish between acceptable entertainment and systematic criminal violence. The normalization of extreme abuse as imperial art created a society where moral boundaries had been permanently erased, and resistance had become psychologically impossible for entire generations of Romans who had been conditioned to see human suffering as divine entertainment worthy of celebration rather than criminal activity demanding intervention. Commodus's declaration that he was the living reincarnation of Hercules represented more than imperial megalomania, but a systematic corruption of Roman religious institutions that transformed sacred spaces into theaters for ritualized abuse disguised as divine worship. This wasn't just personal delusion, but calculated policy designed to make systematic, intimate violence appear religiously mandated rather than criminally motivated. The transformation of traditional Roman religious ceremonies into opportunities for imperial exploitation reveals sophisticated understanding of how spiritual authority could be weaponized to overcome moral resistance. Temple priests, who had once conducted rituals celebrating virtue and civic duty, found themselves required to perform ceremonies that celebrated systematic human degradation as evidence of divine favor and imperial blessing. The reinterpretation of Hercules mythology provided theological justification for practices that violated every principle of traditional Roman morality. Commodus commissioned new religious texts that portrayed the legendary hero's labors as metaphors for intimate conquest and domination rather than service and sacrifice. These corrupted narratives were taught in schools, performed in theaters, and preached in temples as official imperial theology. Vestal virgins, whose purity had symbolized Roman spiritual integrity for centuries, were forced to participate in ceremonies that mocked their vows while simultaneously being presented as honor to their service. The psychological torture of compelling these women to participate in their own spiritual destruction while maintaining the fiction that such participation demonstrated religious devotion reveals the sophisticated cruelty of Commodus's approach to institutional corruption. The international religious community reacted with horror to reports of Roman temple practices under Commodus. Religious leaders from Egypt, Judea, and other provinces sent desperate appeals to Roman authorities begging for intervention to prevent further corruption of sacred institutions. Their letters, preserved in various archives, provide external confirmation of the systematic nature of religious corruption that challenged the spiritual foundations of Mediterranean civilization. The psychological impact on Roman religious practitioners was devastating and permanent. Priests who had devoted their lives to serving gods associated with justice, wisdom, and protection found themselves compelled to conduct rituals that celebrated exactly the opposite values. Many chose suicide rather than continued participation, while others developed psychological disorders that rendered them incapable of normal religious function. By 190 CE, Roman society had been so thoroughly corrupted by 12 years of Commodus's systematic abuse that normal governmental, social, and economic functions had become impossible. The empire that had once conquered the Mediterranean through disciplined organization and moral authority had devolved into a criminal enterprise designed primarily to satisfy one man's appetite for human suffering, disguised imperial entertainment and religious duty. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting more, click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can keep peeling back the layers together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.